Good morning. I'm Kirsten Spaulding, your moderator for today's 2020 Investor Summit on the Climate Risk, our digital program. I'm the Senior Department Director for the Investor Network at Ceres. Ceres is a sustainability nonprofit working with the most influential investors and companies on the greatest sustainability challenges of our time, including climate risk, deforestation, water pollution and scarcity, and inequitable workplaces. Before we begin today's program, I'd like to share our heartfelt sympathy for the family and friends of George Floyd. Ceres stands in strong solidarity with the Black community and the peaceful protesters who are challenging systemic racism. As an organization dedicated to building a just and sustainable future, we realize that eliminating racial injustice is crucial to creating the kind of future we seek. Our hearts also go out to everyone affected by the ongoing impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. We're especially grateful to those working so hard to ensure that we all stay healthy and safe as possible. We look forward to working with investors, companies, and policymakers in the coming months to ensure that we build back better from COVID-19 and support a climate-smart economic recovery. One of the many ways we can do that is to focus on today's discussion, accelerating the world's transition to a net zero emissions economy. Investors are a critical piece of this work. I want to also thank each of you for joining us and recognize our summit co-hosts, the UN Foundation and the UN Office for Partnerships, and their generous commitment and support of our speakers and sponsors who've stood by us in this digital journey to reimagine Ceres 2020 and the 2020 Investor Summit on Climate Risk. We clearly wouldn't be here today without your essential support. Before we begin today's session, investors aligning with the Paris Agreement, setting investment portfolios on a path towards zero emissions. A few logistical notes. The session is being recorded. We will be providing all participants with a link to the recording shortly after its completion. If you have any questions, please enter them in the chat box that's located on your control panel on the right side of your screen. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible at the end of the session. And please note that there is the potential that due to global bandwidth issues, we may experience some challenges. Unfortunately, this is beyond our control. If it does happen, the discussion will pause for a few seconds to allow for bandwidth to readjust. We want to thank you ahead of time for your patience in the event of such an issue. It's now my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's session, Ryan Hobart, Managing Director, Climate and Environment, UN Foundation. Welcome, Ryan.
Thanks, Kirsten. I'm excited to moderate what I think is going to be a really interesting discussion on investor efforts to reach net zero emissions, as called for by both the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement. And as Kirsten said, specifically, we're going to be talking about the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, which was launched at the UN Secretary General's Climate Action Summit last September. And as you'll hear in more detail from our panelists, the Asset Owner Alliance is an international group of institutional investors representing more than $4.5 trillion in assets under management, delivering on a bold commitment to transition their investment portfolios to net zero emissions by 2050 in order to keep the world under 1.5 degrees of warming. During today's session, we'll hear about how the Alliance was formed, what its goals are, how it operates, how it works with others, and how it can encourage other investors in the private sector more broadly to join net zero efforts. But first, let me introduce our really good panel. We have Urs Bitterling, who's the head of corporate responsibility at Allianz and one of the founders and leaders of the Asset Owner Alliance. We have Caroline Laberge, who's an investment stewardship advisor at the Caisse de dépôt et de placement du Québec, CDPQ, Canada's second largest pension fund. And CDPQ is also a founding member of the Alliance. And last but not least, Eric Usher, who's the head of the UN Environment Program's Finance Initiative, UNEP-FI, which convenes the Alliance along with Principles for Responsible Investment. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that I started my career working for Eric UNEP in the early 2000s. So it's great to be on this webinar with him. After a discussion with the panel, we'll save about 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. So if you have questions for the panel, please send those in through the chat function at any time, and we'll get to as many of your questions as possible. Let's jump right in. And let's start broad and start digging in on particular issues. And Eric, if I could start with you, could you tell us the origin story of the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance? How did it come about, and why was it created?
Thanks very much, Ryan, and thanks very much for the invitation to join this session. I try to frame a little bit, I would say, what the conditions or what was happening at the time this alliance got started. It actually dates back to California when Governor Jerry Brown at the time had his planned this summit with many parties, and there was a behind the scenes meeting between the UN Assistant Secretary General Bob Orr, who had been tasked with preparing this heads of state meeting, the climate summit you referred to in September 2019, which would have been 12 months after. And he was having some discussions to try to figure out what that summit should focus on. What should heads of state be talking about? We have a UNFCCC, which is a place where governments get together to negotiate on climate. That process, moves in fits and starts. And the UN Secretary General tries to consider how he can help with that process and what exactly is needed. And a lot of it is about establishing ambition for governments to ratchet up in what they're doing related to climate in terms of climate action, but also bringing in non-state actors, other actors. And if you remember where we were in 2018, I would say there were three things that were happening, all positive. You had the TCFD recommendations that come out in the year prior, and corporates, including in the financial community, were starting to disclose and figuring out how to go about it, which was positive. You had Climate Action 100 Plus that was formed, focusing on the 100 largest emitters globally and ratcheting up engagement action. And I think starting then, and certainly more recently, we've started to see some positive impacts of those collective actions. And the third, of course, we had the green bonds market continuing to expand quite quickly. I think it was about 150 billion in issuance in that year. However, when Bob Orr put the question to Gunter Thallinger, who is the CIO at Allianz, which is one of the world's largest investors, he said, what does high ambition look like for the financial industry today? Is it on disclosure? Is it on engagement? Is it on green bonds? And Gunter's response was, well, it's on everything. In Allianz, we're doing everything. We're doing a lot of things related to climate. But ambition is, a lot of these efforts are around best efforts. Why do you engage? Well, we're trying to work with the corporate sector on reducing emissions, on managing risks. But a lot of it doesn't have the end game of where are we leading towards. And Thallinger basically said, it's obvious what we don't yet have, but what we need is we need to set our sights on net zero. We have the IPCC, we have other scientific analysis showing that for various reasons, global level, we need to get to net zero. Essentially, we need to have our emissions the next decade, and then we need to have them again, and we have to get to, by 2050, if not earlier, to net zero emissions. He said that's what high ambition looks like. And for financial actors and for large institutional investors who are building a lot of experience on disclosure, on green finance, on engagement, we need basically a framework where all of those pieces come together towards essentially a business objective, which is eliminating emissions from our portfolio. And that was essentially the inception. So it was basically building on all the positive progress that was happening by tying it together into what starts to become decision critical at the board level of these organizations to say, okay, well, let's set a target and let's work towards meeting it. So that's what then led to the opening of the Climate Summit in New York last September. Oliver Bäte, who's the CEO of Allianz, who along with 12 other CEOs from 12 organizations, essentially launched the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance. I think Urs and Caroline can talk more to the specifics. I think very important elements: net zero by 2050, but milestone targets starting in 2025. So every 5 years, a specific target and accountability towards working towards that target. The main tool is through engagement. Of course, divestment is may be needed, but the starting point is to engage, and on a sector basis. So driving emissions reductions within specific sectors and really in the real economy. So it's not so much about dumping the emissions to someone else, but it's working with companies that you own to actually help them reduce emissions. So I think with that, that's kind of the framing. I think really the devil's in the detail now, but it's a fantastic grouping of leaders within the investment industry who basically have set a target, but now essentially are working through how do you go about it and how do we put in place the methodologies, the milestones, the progress to show that it can be done, and essentially to benefit through learning by doing.
Thanks, Eric. That's really helpful to set the stage. Caroline, could you tell us a little bit from the point of view of an investor, and CDPQ was in this at the very beginning. What did that look like, and was it easy to join in, or was it something that you debated internally? Why did you join, and how did that happen?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. In 2017, CDPQ adopted its climate change strategy. So we had already established ambitious footprint reduction targets for 2025, targets to increase our green investments. And we've been working closely with our investment team. So, in this context, joining the Alliance seemed like a completely logical continuation and kind of extension of what we're already doing. We like the fact that it's collaborative work, which is highly formative, and we're able to leverage the capacities of all the members to work on these complicated issues. And I think one point that's also worth mentioning for us is the fact that members are like-minded investors with long-term views. So that's also very interesting from our perspective.
It's really helpful. Urs, maybe you could answer that question as well and talk. Eric mentioned that Allianz was at the table at the very beginning. And then also add anything to what Eric's description of how the Alliance works, the target setting framework, how you're going about that.
Sure. Thank you, Ryan, and thank you for having me. Really, there's a few convictions that stand behind the AOA. One is certainly none of us are big to tackle this alone. And this is simply in the sense of the lever that we have, but also operatively. Eric mentioned just a few key initiatives that are so important to getting us there, such as TCFD, such as Climate Action 100. But the truth is, they all cost resources. So what is the unifying link? That was the question. The unifying link is ambition. Allianz, prior to the AOA, committed to the Science Based Target Initiative, which is essentially the same story, just thought from one step after another. That basically it's your commitment to set intermediary targets in line with scientific emission reduction requirements. The AOA, which I think the compelling idea behind the AOA is, we know the end game. And that is net zero 2050. And that is what basically all our governments have committed to in the Paris Agreement. And that is also what science tells us. The devil lies in the detail. And if we spend more time trying to figure out these details, what happens is that we have even less time. And as Eric said, the AOA is not about portfolio cleaning or dumping the emissions to somebody else, as you called it. It is really setting in motion a dynamic in the real economy, and obviously the financial sector is just one part of it, that delivers massive emission reductions in line with science and in line with the commitment that our governments made in 2015. I think I'll come a bit later to the fact what we are doing now, but essentially we now need to operationalize the 2050 commitment as has been said into 5-year targets. We are currently working very heavily on a target setting framework that is a pragmatic approach trying to align the best available technologies out there into a pragmatic usable approach. So with the target in mind to formulate our first 5-year intermediary target until 2025 by the end of the year.
That's really helpful. So maybe back to Eric. So I know that there was recently the Alliance issued a call for the development of methodologies to help its members pursue carbon neutrality goals. Is this essentially an acknowledgement that you simply don't have the tools you need at the moment? And more broadly, have you basically committed to doing something without knowing how to do it at the outset?
Let me. I think that maybe I would defer that question back to Urs. I think he's pointed out the very important observation that in this space, it's quite easy to actually find excuses why not to act. We know data is an issue. Data is a challenge for everyone in the ESG space, in the climate space. However, that doesn't get us to where we need to go. So at the same time, if any one actor decides to go about, chooses or designs its own methodology about how you're going to assess companies, it can be quite hard to defend it because potentially there are gaps. And therefore, by having a group of institutions working together, working with the best in the scientific community, we can essentially start to group source methodologies. They can be tested, they can be refined. To essentially, so you're not totally blind, but you don't know everything as you start to move. But Urs, can you give a little bit more detail around the call for methodologies?
Yeah, that would be great.
I'm happy to. So yes, there is not the perfect methodology that we can all draw from. We need to improvise to a certain extent. And that's exactly also one of the powerful opportunities of the AUA, because we all sit in the same boat. We all know that where we are going to meet by 2050. That's what we've promised in front of the General Assembly in September of last year. So we are pooling resources. We have different experiences. We have different approaches that some of us are actually quite close to. So it is doable. It is doable. And also, given this is a step-by-step approach, you might not be exactly sure how your step between 2030 and 2035 looks like. That doesn't mean that you can't act and take sufficient steps between 2020 and 2025. And speaking of things we lack, methodologies are not perfect, but what we certainly lack and can't lose anymore is time. We have 30 years for the transition to a low carbon net zero world to happen. This is challenging, and we need to get started. Every year that we lose in a theoretical debate will mean that we will have to take more drastic steps in our portfolio eventually. And so it's really just prudent to start out as soon as we can and start walking, with what we know. We don't know everything, but we know enough to start acting.
That's great. So Caroline, let me go to you and let's talk a little bit about who you work with. So the individual companies you invest in, but also other actors. Caroline, could you, Eric mentioned the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosures, which is an effort to get entire sectors to disclose what their exposure to certain climate-related risks are and how they should respond to that. How are you working in the context of TCFD and in particular with individual companies Tell us a little bit what that relationship is like as part of the alliance as you're moving towards net zero.
Definitely. So, you know, we see TCFD as being extremely important, and it should be mandatory, maybe not for very small companies, but anything in the course of a reasonable size, whether it's public or private. And the idea here is not to create additional paperwork, but rather to use a framework to really tell a story that we need to hear, especially as long-term investors. And you know, I think it's the opportunity for companies to really think about TCFD in terms of opportunities. For example, how are you going to adapt your products and market yourselves as green and greener than your competitors? We know that sectors will be impacted differently by climate change. You know, as long-term investors, it's important for us to find opportunities in each of those sectors. So even though in certain sectors there may be you know, very little to say, no major risks, as company, we want you know, we want you to show us that you have thought about those issues, as you have put a governance framework in place that allows you to reflect on these issues and basically to share the conclusions of this reflection with us. So basically, it's just a matter of show us that you thought about it, show us how it impacts you, and I think TCFD is a great framework to do that.
It's really helpful. Urs, let me turn to you. We know that in general, these kinds of initiatives are much easier to do in Europe for a variety of reasons, including legislation, regulations already in place. Can you say a little bit about how you've been thinking about engaging investors in North America? Obviously, we have CDPQ here, but I'm thinking also of American investors.
Yeah. I think I should start that our friends at CalPERS were one of the founding members of this initiative as well. So, and it's hard for me to, you know, touch upon the fiduciary duty thing, but certainly, you know, when you work under the auspices of the UN, a global reach is necessary. It was certainly easier to recruit fellow asset owners in Europe. That is true, but that is also, it's very clear that we are not going to stop there. This is not an exclusive club of climate leaders. This is hopefully an inclusive club of asset owners who will protect and manage climate risk in their portfolios. So, you know, we are not where we need to be in terms of size, although almost 5 trillion is something, but we've got ways to go. And North America is for sure a very important market on that.
Yeah, and in case people didn't hear you well, so the one American member of the alliance is CalPERS, the California Teachers Pension Fund. Or no, sorry, that's CalSTRS. CalPERS, the California Pension Fund. Let's turn to a couple of other actors, just so people get a sense of how you relate to them. Eric, what about the banking sector? Are there similar things happening to the alliance in the banking sector, and what do you need from banks in this process? Did we lose Eric? Eric, we're unable to hear you, Eric.
Apologies, sorry, I had some background noise.
There you go.
Yeah, no, certainly there is some thinking going on in the banking sector. There are similarities. Obviously, there are differences as well in terms of how banks work with corporates and other customers as compared to investors. I think the similarities are around the need to do target setting around, as Urs talked about, in terms of getting focus. Banks have been in terms of green bonds, they have a lot of issuance has come through bank securitizations, and there's the potential to do a lot more. And there's obviously a relationship between banks and investors in that area. I think one thing, when you think of sectors in transition, let's say coal sectors, coal communities, you know, some of these industries who are going to go through significant change and maybe even get shut down, Those types of actors, when you're in trouble as a corporate, you actually don't really pay much attention to your investors. You pay attention to your creditors and your banks. And therefore, the notion of a just transition and figuring out how these communities are going to move to new forms of economic development, a lot of that responsibility is going to fall on the back of banks who really feel often that, you know, they are closely associated to the communities they operate in. So they will also play a very important role in this transition, complementary, sometimes with the investment community, sometimes independent of. There is a group under the Principles for Responsible Banking, there's a subgroup of 38 banks who've signed up to a commitment called the Collective Commitment for Climate Action, which essentially is also a net zero target. Looking at their, it's holistic across organizations, across their entire loan books, their loan portfolios. So in some ways, methodologically, they need to look at the same type of analysis about how do you do that. And if you're going to look at the sector basis, if you're going to decarbonize steel, you need to figure out how the steel sector, what is a benchmark or transition for the steel sector, and then whether you're lending to it or you're investing into it, you might engage in a different way, but that the sound methodological science starts from the same place. So there definitely needs to be, I think, an increasing dialogue also between the lenders, the banks, and the investors. That's starting, and we're trying to help foster that. But it's still early days. But there's a similar culture, which is we don't have all the methodologies, we don't have all the data we need today, but we also don't have any time to waste.
I think that's a very interesting point, if I may add, Ryan. I think, you know, banks also have a role to play to engage their own clients as well. So I think there's room for opportunities here, and, you know, for the banking sector to really originate long-term assets and to help structure opportunities that will generate the transition. So I think there's room for collaboration 100%.
That's great. So we can't have a webinar in the midst of COVID and not talk a little bit about the impact that it's having across the economy and in the financial sector. Urs, maybe I'll just start with you and ask you how that's affected your company, but also more broadly, how it affects the Alliance's work, or maybe not.
Well, I think there's a few things. There's a few tactical things, and then there is really some lessons to be learned. And I work for a global financial company that certainly relied on a lot of business travel in the past, and I guess really we've gotten to take a peek in the future how international or global collaboration can look like without just bombing constantly from one place or from one continent to another. So I think that is, you know, in all its horrible impacts it has, there's also really some lessons that we can learn. With regards to the AOA, it's really a tactical thing. What is clear is when we see companies or sectors fighting for survival, it is inappropriate and foremost unwise to send a letter and be like, "Hi, I'm the smart climate guy. I have an issue for you guys." So timing, I think, is really, really important. But what has gotten more immediate and more immediate than we had anticipated is really when we think about the green recovery and government spending that is currently being set up, and looking at the sheer sizes of these stimulus programs, we know that this money can only be spent once. You know, it's simply not going to be there if we knock on our transition to be financed at some point. So it's a huge opportunity. You know, these funds were simply not available 6-7 months ago. So if we get this right, we actually might jumpstart us into the future. We might actually be able to pull levers in the sense of government spending. And let's be clear, we need all hands on deck for this. We need the regulator, we need public assets, we need private assets to actually really get us going, you know. And obviously there's the immediate crisis relief aspect to this that needs to be there, no doubt about it. But then let's spend our money wisely. Let's spend it future-proof. And that is actually a huge opportunity.
Great. Caroline or Eric, anything to add on that?
I mean, I'll circle back to what I said at the very beginning. We're long-term investors. We're looking at sustainable investing as a priority. So I think more than ever, ESG is an important part of our risk analysis, and just ensuring sustainable value creation in our portfolio companies. But I think it goes back to how we operate in the very first place. So I agree with what Urs has just said, but I think it also makes a lot of sense in regards to what we do.
I think maybe to add to Urs and Caroline,
Yeah.
couple things. First of all, through the crisis, we've seen the value of system resilience, and that some systems are, in some countries, some corporations are more resilient than others. Risk-taking has a cost when you get a downturn. And therefore, what would seem to be obvious, but for many years is not so obvious about how companies are being run. We think of many aspects of maybe running things on too short a buffer, and that when it comes to a crisis sinks the ship. I think the second is collective action, and that it just doesn't make sense to go it alone in terms of fighting a pandemic, in terms of fighting climate change. And I think we would hope that we have a vote of confidence in the value of collective action. And I think the last one, and Urs, you mentioned the green or the stimulus and how's it going to be spent. And if we look back, one of the big problems in the last decade is no growth, and there are so many societal issues, equity issues, other issues that get worse when economies don't grow. When we came out of the post-war period, although the war was extremely destructive, as Europe was rebuilt, we essentially set off a 40-year growth boom that essentially petered out for various reasons, I guess, in the 1990s. I think coming out of COVID now, we know demand has to be rebuilt. Stimulus, historic levels of capital is being committed to create that demand. But the question is, are we going to, rebuild the system that is low resilience for future crises like climate, or are we going to build low carbon infrastructure? It's so obvious. I believe that's a large part of the reason why Paris was successful, because at the time you had the Obama administration, you had China and Europe, and for all of them it was very obvious. Investing in low carbon is a good growth story. Why shouldn't we do it, particularly in a low interest rate environment? We're back to that situation again. The politics are a little bit more complicated, but the underlying rationale for investing in our future is as good as ever, and we're going to invest. The capital has been committed, so let's do it in the right way.
That's great. Let me ask a few questions before we get to Q&A about policy and what you need from political leaders. Maybe Urs, you could take this one. What do you expect from policy and political leaders as you strive to reach net zero? And a broader question really about whether it's possible to do what you're trying to do without a whole of society commitment to tackling climate change.
So, I mean, let me quote my CEO on this. And he, when he talks about Paris, and he used the same thinking or the same reasoning again for the AOA, was, what we as business can do by committing, or as the financial sector, by committing to certain climate goals, is we can set the stage for political action. you know, Allianz manages 750 billion euros in insurance premiums. That is something that is not enough to do it alone, and it's certainly not our money, so we're not playing with it. You know, we are dead serious. And when we do that, that might tell policymakers something. You know, it's actually possible. There's so much noise and so many perceived reasons why not to do it and stuff. And what we do is we lose time. So somebody needs to make the first step. It's not enough. We need policymakers, you know, to step up. Of course, we need the real economy to step up. Of course, that's actually what we are asking for, you know, develop decarbonization pathways, in other words, ambitious climate strategies. So, you know, this is the ideological idea behind it. And if you look at it, I was actually quite surprised, but because I work in for almost 15 years now, and one common call was always, we need better data. And Caroline touched upon it, you know, TCFD, for example. Why not standardize it? That alone will unlock so much potential within the that it's actually quite little asks to answer your question that we have to policymakers in the beginning. You know, standardize climate disclosures. It will already get us, and as talked about, the step-by-step approach. It will keep us busy for a few years. You know, we can work with that, and let's see it. Let's not make this daunting, huge list of this is what we needed, this is what we needed, this is what we need. Step by step.
So that's a very clear ask to policymakers around climate disclosure, which I think is really helpful. Caroline, as we look forward, in particular now that the COP26 has been delayed a year, and as I think most people know, in the run-up to COP26, country actors are being called on to make updates and enhance their plans on climate. How are your efforts at the Alliance coming alongside those efforts that political leaders are making about enhancing ambition over the short and longer term?
You know, I believe it's by working together like we've been doing, you know, by trying to contribute effectively to the fight against climate change, having a collaborative approach. We'll continue our global approach to mobilize our team internally and partners at all level. But I think disclosure, collaborative efforts and dialogue is extremely important. So just, you know, COP26 or not, we have to keep moving forward. And I think Urs said it very well at the very beginning. It's one thing that can't wait. So we just have to keep working like we've been doing and get more people on board and have an even more inclusive dialogue. So whether it's with politicians or the banking sector, we need to have everyone on board.
That's great. And then final question about partners. Eric, could you say a little bit about the international financial institutions, including development banks and others? How's the Alliance relating to them, and what's the potential interaction there?
Yeah, I mean, there have been some discussions, and I think there will be more. Obviously, they are distinct with a specific mission and mandate. Typically, they're very advanced in terms of the methodologies, in terms of and it obviously it varies, but you have for instance, the European Investment Bank, who right now is a target that 50% of everything they do will be climate. It's a very large organization for a development bank. Now, for them, like an Allianz, to actually deliver on 50% of their transactions being climate focused, they need to work with a lot of partners to do that, including with institutional investors and others. So there's a relationship there. Also with groups like the World Bank Group, IFC, etc. You know, the IFIs are meant to address market failures, typically where there are financing gaps because markets are not yet mature enough for private capital to come in. And one of the challenges that institutional investors have is, although often the best opportunities might be in emerging markets or even developing countries, regulatory wise, it's not so easy to put capital easily into these markets. And so there is a very good role for the international financial institutions to play an intermediating role, to create platforms, green bond platforms where you can invest. A Scandinavian can invest based on a regulatory structure that works for them, but where the capital maybe goes through an IFI into a market in the emerging markets. So I think there are various ways where there can be relationships. I think it's very important that the AOA target is a sort of mandate that the international finance institutions have or should have. And on the banking side, where the IFIs have played a very important role, going far beyond the financing they provide, is the safeguards they establish. Because particularly operating in emerging markets, most environmental social safeguards or standards are set by the IFIs. Most of them use the IFC performance standards. And one of the developments we would like to see is that the IFIs start to put into their safeguards the requirement that their clients, including intermediaries like banks, not only fulfill basic safeguards on environmental social standards, but also start to have targets in place. So for instance, if you're an IFI who's going to finance emissions reductions through a green credit line in a developing country, an emerging market, that institution you work through, let's say it's an international bank, does that international bank have a target to reduce their overall emissions? They should have that, even if they're going to manage a green credit line, because the rest of their credit lines should also be greening over time. And so essentially, I think this relationship and the ability of the IFIs to ratchet safeguards so that the expectations are, you've got the basics in terms of risk management in place, you're not putting capital into the wrong places, but we also need to get the capital into the right places. And for doing that, we essentially need to start setting targets to transition the entire portfolios of these organizations. And the IFIs, I think, have a strong role potentially in helping contribute that.
That's great, thanks. So let me ask one real quick final question before we turn to Q&A. What's next for the Alliance? What's your vision for the next couple of years and out to 2025? And maybe first, you want to start with that.
Sorry, what the ambition for my organization is?
What the Alliance is going to be doing over the short and medium term? What are you guys looking at?
So the Alliance is currently working as the most important item of our agenda, is working on a target setting framework to enable us as an Alliance to set portfolio targets for the next 5 years until 2025. That then needs to be implemented. So we are working, Eric has in the very beginning already mentioned, how are we going to reach that? It might differ from asset class to asset class, but for the large bulk of our portfolio, the liquid asset class, it's about engagement. It's about changing the dynamics in the real economy or supporting the ongoing, or the emerging transition dynamic across high emitting sectors. This is the most important, and certainly, we know that we made a bold statement by the commitment, and now with our heads on the chopping board, we better deliver how that's going to look like in the next 5 years.
Great. So Eric, did you want to say something? I saw you move forward. No? Okay. So let's move to Q&A. We've already got a couple questions. We'll try to do as many as possible. The first one is from Thomas Christensen, who is a Danish diplomat and used to work on climate in the SG's office and the Secretary General of the UN's office. What can the Alliance do to accelerate phase out of new coal investments and coal in general as a first step in shedding stranded assets and moving away from fossil fuel investments? Giving the timelines to 2050, we should give similar attention to phasing out fossil fuels to scaling up the alternatives as we enter a race to scale ambition towards COP26. The investors can make a real impact here. Who wants to talk about that a little bit?
I can take an early stab if you
Please
come in, Caroline and Eric. First of all, to be very clear, the Asset Owner Alliance, for various reasons, is not discussing collective divestment. I think we are legally also not able to. But you know, the way we answer this as Allianz, as the company, you know, one member of the AOA, is certainly, you know, the commitment is clear. The commitment is clear, net zero 2050. There might be assets that are not transformable, such as coal. And you can take your, you know, think that thought to your end. And, you know, for us, it's pretty open. There might be others. Then there is assets that are certainly high emitting now, but that have potential to you know, reduce first, and then we think about whether they can stay in the portfolio over time or not. And the best example is in Europe, we have immense pressure, for example, to move away from oil and gas. Truth is, if we don't get methane leakage within that sector under control within the next 5 years, goodbye 1.5 degrees, most likely goodbye 2 degrees. So what I'm saying is that even if you think, oh, ultimately this sector is never going to reach net zero or whatever, you know, there's immediate steps that need to happen. They need to happen for the transition overall to work. And that is so important. So rather than thinking about, you know, what is brown and what is green and what is light green, everybody has steps to take. And let's see how many there are, but they need to happen. They need to happen. And that's how our portfolio emission reductions will start to occur, really, rather than, you know, dumping the emissions to somebody else. Because as I know, whenever we sell, there's another owner. That's not going to work.
Other thoughts on that? Eric, go ahead.
No, just to, I mean, Thomas, you ask very important, challenging questions. Just to give, I think, one positive development recently in China. Some of you may have seen that they've recently eliminated clean coal from the green taxonomy used essentially for green bond issuance. So positive steps linked to, you know, a very important market development. But I think one of the reasons why China and Europe were out of sync on taxonomy was clean coal. Now that's gone, which I think is good. I think our hopes are that that will apply not only in China, but also to Chinese state-owned enterprise as they invest abroad. As we know, that's a big area of concern. I think another positive development has been in terms of the commercial banks in Japan have also recently taken some important steps around divesting from coal. I think, Urs, you did have recently on coal, you've divested from underwriting. So you're no longer insuring coal projects. So I think there are a lot of positive steps happening.
Yeah.
And, you know.
I mean, I can, to sum it up, you know, the AOA is ultimately about the transition. And what we, you know, the decisions where we restrict our investment universe, also to put that into this frame of mind. So we actually pre-announce, you know, the way how we define a coal-related asset, and we publish that so companies can orientate, you know, and when you're underneath that threshold, you are viable for an investment and you remain viable, because we also know that a utility, you know, it's not about that they haven't heard the call. You know, these things take time and these things are complex. And we think it's fair and helpful to let you know, this is where we think you need to go. You know, based on the scientific evidence we have, and that really helps.
Great. So second question, and maybe Caroline, I'll ask this, since you started to address this earlier in the call. The questioner asks, can you share any insights on how you're publicly pressing companies to move more rapidly towards net zero, along with private discussions? Are you using your voice and leverage as investors to press companies to change voting proxies, filing shareholder proposals, that sort of thing?
That's a very good question. Honestly, we've been engaging a lot with companies and a constructive dialogue. Yep. We're good.
Go ahead. We lost you for 1 second. Maybe just start that sentence over.
No, I was saying it's a very good question, and it's definitely aligned with the way we see things at CDPQ, but I also think more broadly as part of the Alliance. You know, we wish to really exercise our influence through dialogue, but also proxy voting. It's something that we take very seriously. We actually do all of our proxy voting internally. So we look at each of the, you know, shareholder proposals. We've been seeing more and more shareholder proposals on climate change. I think it's a great way to convey messages. And you know, we've been moving from what used to be a very governance-oriented exercise, and now it's way more ESG. There's a broader dialogue, and it's a great way to engage with companies, and it shows how everything is linked, you know, from governance to environment to the S and ESG and social. And I think it's a great way to really convey your messages, and definitely a strategy that we have in place at CDPQ in terms of you know, proactive and reactive engagement. We've been seeing more and more companies actually coming to us to ask for advice, to know how should I be disclosing, what are the frameworks that I should be using. So it's definitely reassuring to see that there's a momentum happening.
So let me follow up, because there's another question that's pretty closely related. The questioner says all the voluntary actions by companies to reduce emissions won't get us to the end game to net zero. To what extent are you and other asset owners looking at whether companies are using the most powerful tool they have to fight climate change, their political influence, to advocate for policies that we need to achieve net zero? Yeah, and it goes on a little bit, but would someone like to, that's a slightly different framing of a few of the questions. Maybe Eric, if you have some thoughts on that.
I would just make the comment, and I think you were asking earlier about policy action. I mean, let's remember that a large part of I mentioned Paris and why it was successful, but I think there was another reason why it was successful, is because the investment community, the financial community, and more broadly, the private sector were really on side. And they were sending the signals to governments who had to get together and sign up to what could be a difficult deal. But governments went to Paris feeling comfortable that when they signed up to a deal, the headlines at home in the newspapers would not be that they signed up to a job killer, that essentially that this is the future. And the financial sector plays a very, very important signaling role to give comfort to governments that this is where we need to go. This is where we need to head. And this is a growth story. And I think you're right, that's the power of corporates to do that. That's the power of the financial industry. Individual actions are important. The signals those actions send are doubly important.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I think there's a lot of, you know, just circle back on what Eric just said, you know, consumer education at the end of the day and information, they're driving change as well. So I think everyone needs to play its role. So whether it's us, but policymakers. So definitely room for improvement, but I think it's reassuring to see that things are going on the right track.
That's great. Well, thank you all. I'm going to turn it back over to Kirsten, but I want to ask her a question of what essentially what's Ceres doing to encourage investors to align with Paris in the transition to net zero. Love to hear more.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you so much, Ryan, and thank you so much to all of our panelists. This was a really exciting, interesting session. A couple of the themes that you highlighted, the theme around systemic change. I mean, we can't do this in one sector with one group of social actors, the investors, the companies, the policymakers. We've really got to work together. And that is really where Ceres is focusing our work at this point. We've launched a new initiative, the Capital Markets Accelerator, and we have a Paris-aligned portfolio project there where we're working with our members, our investor network members, on the tools, the methodologies, the target setting, all of these things that you're talking about. It's hard work, as you pointed out, but there are paths forward, and our group of large asset managers, largest asset owners here in the US and in Canada are really focused on this with you. So it's exciting to be working together on this. We're participants in the investor agenda with UNFFI and PRI and our network partners, AIGCC, IIGCC, and IGCC around the world. So really, we're getting a sense of a movement coming together to work on this. So it's exciting to be part of this work, and we'll look forward to how it is our investors are going to issue climate action plans and really begin to implement these targets that they're just beginning to articulate. So, great. Before we adjourn, I really want to thank our summit co-hosts, the series, the UN Foundation, and the UN Office for Partnerships, and the sponsors that you see on the screen who provided instrumental support for today's program. Please note you'll receive a follow-up email with a recording of this session shortly. And to learn more about other upcoming sessions from now through June 25th, please visit series2020.org. Thank you so much for being with us today, and we'll look forward to following up and continuing this important work.
Thank you.
Thank you.